hand it over to Dr. Wilson.
Thank you very much. I apologize for deviating, but looking left or right would just drain me, and this will keep me from staring at my laptop doing my dean's work here in California or whatever. But just a little bit about the paper and about my background and interest. I am an ardent supporter of Donald Trump. I prefer his policy ideas. I think his ideas will move the country forward. I do think we should not be dealing in special considerations and those kinds of things that are detrimental, right? All right, now stop. Think about what it is you thought about me in those instances. I saw it, so you don't have to front.
Oh my God, I love that.
Did you vet this guy? All right.
I would really to be very open-minded.
Right. So I'm a political psychologist, all right, and we study behavior for a living in the context of politics. And politics is about behavior and getting people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. Behavior is very predictable, and some of these arguments we've been making today the outcomes are very predictable. We've been studying them for quite some time: training, education, messaging. We know the outcomes and how they work. The biggest filter we often forget about is just simply identity. We talk about race, but race is not necessarily identity, it's a category. Our identity is who we connect with and how we connect with them. I had an identity, but you looked at me like I didn't. Or I had one that was different than yours, even if you were within my group. Again, I saw you all. All right, so information processing lies at the foundation of my work, and all of the subsequent emotions that come from processing that information, and how we make decisions, and how we judge things, and how we make appraisals of things are part of what I'm interested in. And so I'll tell you a little bit about my paper, but I also want to talk about how the notion of progress is a part of that, right? And so there's a psychology behind all of this. So equality is about the attainment of rights, right? Opening access, providing opportunities, enforcement of non-discriminatory activities. And the possession of a right is a realization of a claim made on and accepted by a dominant group, typically, or an out-group, right? So priming identity creates groups, in-groups and out-groups. And the out-group usually is the one that holds a right, and the in-group is asking for it, just in the case of this room here. So claimants emphasize what needs to be changing, and those other people like the status quo. They think everything is okay. We talked about that context quite a bit today. And the moral ground operates on both sides. We forget about that, right? So yeah, everybody got to give up something. The lower status group and the higher status group. And so I want to talk a little bit about that contention. So I use this just as a classic example. It's polarization, equality is somewhere in the middle, and you have opposite groups, like group one over here, group two, Hatfield McCoy's Coke versus Pepsi. Democrats and Republicans, Cowboys and Redskins, whichever ones you want to use there. And the whole idea is that we're trying to move to some notion of equality, because equality is the moral ground that we are supposed to value. And the assumptions are that when we get to equality, there'll be peace, there'll be agreement, there'll be respect, there'll be understanding, there'll be tolerance, there'll be egalitarianism, and we'll want to help each other. We've talked a lot about that here, right? But equality is really painful. We know that, we just don't talk about it as much, right? Because for us to talk about it would induce pain in us and discomfort, right? So imagine if I was the one Trump supporter in the room, how much I would talk, the same way as if you were the one non-Trump supporter in another room and they had to listen to you and discomfort and the like. So both groups have to give up something. Resources need to be reallocated. We talk about losses. Norms are going to have to change. Values across the board are going to have to be revisited. When you get to equality, you got to deal with that. Statuses and privileges become questioned. We've talked about that. Power is shared and culture is appropriated. Just like one group may not like how another group represents their culture, the other group has to deal with the same exact thing. You're not going to keep the things the way you want them to be if you value equality in the true essential form, right? Now, if you take a moral or a substantive, my position is right, your position is wrong thing, this won't make any sense, it won't work for you. But that's not human behavior. That's your behavior and your beliefs operating. So the reality is equality brings about uncertainty, it brings about disagreement, disrespect, it brings about conflict, it brings about stoppage and retrenchment. We stop wanting to do for others because we like the way things are, and everything becomes an impingement. So we talked about people don't want to give up what they have. It could be they don't want to give more of what they've been giving. Or they could believe that giving more doesn't work. So there's nuance to this idea, and equality, while it may have a moral high ground, that moral high ground is not the same for everyone. So we shouldn't expect there to be a universal standard of how we move in a certain direction and what that looks like on the back end. So we talk about diversity and inclusion, never talk about what it looks like. Society hadn't figured out these things. Why are we sitting in a room thinking we're going to solve them and agree on them? And that's why we stop, right? So we void the idea and we wind up moving on to other things. So it's not worth it. Let's just move on. There's still individuals who still want to fight the fight, for and against it. But in general, you get gridlock. We see that in politics now when things are polarized and pushed a little bit too far. So the main points of my paper were about how when you have a leader who may want to push something in a certain direction, a president, let's say, who was elected fairly, how do you prevent their agenda from happening? Any leader, department chair, your group leader, if you're an organization, political scientists study how decisions are made, and we know that there are usually rules. And so as long as we can manipulate the rules, we can then manipulate what gets chosen and the like. And that happens in Congress, right? Parties are not in the Constitution, but yet they still drive how we make law in this country. Yep. All right, so in the paper, I talk about how political corruption is instantly tied to race, typically through ACORN and many of these other arguments, and they were eventually applied to Obama. I use these cartoon narratives in some of my presentations to talk about how, you know, this big, behemoth, overwhelming guy with cornrows and the like with the acorn shirt is talking to the young lady, and he says, we want you to register to vote 75 times because last time Bush stole the election. So this idea of retaliation, and at all costs, we've got to win this thing or they're going to keep us back. And the innocent little girl's like confused, like, why would I do that? That's not right. But the big black guy, you know, is doing this thing. So these kind of narratives ran throughout the campaign, and they were there after the election occurred. So I want to just show you the gist of the empirical point of the paper is that we did an experiment in 2010, and we asked folks on an online panel survey, national representative sample. We asked them two statements, and we asked them which one of these statements comes closer to your own personal view about why some particular group voted for Obama, even if neither is exactly right. So we're asking them to make a fundamental choice. Did you vote for, or did whites, for example, vote, and everybody got a randomization of one of these different categories? Everybody didn't answer all groups, you just got one of these. Did whites vote for Obama in 2008 because he was African American or because he was the better candidate? Pick. You could also say you were unsure about which one. Another randomized group got African Americans. Another one got majority of Americans. All of these are factually aligned with the narratives of the campaign. And then we have what's called a baseline condition, where we just asked about people. No racial narrative, no racial information, no context to it. Even though Barack Obama's race was what we call chronically accessible, in other words, people knew what his race was, but we had a baseline condition there with the assumption that, hey, race should matter, but should it matter equally across all of these conditions? So just to give the results, which are in the paper, but essentially African Americans were perceived to vote for Obama because of his race, but other groups were perceived to vote for him for more objective decisions and objective reasons. So whites, only 27% of him voted for him because he was African American, 51% voted for him because he was the better candidate. But among African Americans, 68% voted for him because he was African American. Only 23%, these are whites who are reporting their opinions about African Americans. A majority of Americans, 47% of a majority, the group that won, right? A majority of Americans voted for him because he was African American versus 41% better candidate. And people, 51% of people voted for him because he was African American, only 38% because he was a better candidate. The largest group that voted for him because he was African American was African Americans, and the largest group that voted for him because he was a better candidate was, of course, whites. The question was, do racial attitudes have anything to do with these, or are these beliefs and stereotypes that exist out there in the broader idea? What these are the correlations between perceptions of electoral malfeasance, and we ask about 5 or 6 different types of malfeasance, created a scale, and we looked at the correlation between people's perceptions of African Americans requesting special considerations and making excuses for their own behaviors. We looked at the correlation between that. Naturally, the more racial resentment you have, the more you believe there's electoral malfeasance in there. And so we control for ideology and other beliefs and other locations and where you're from and what your age is and education level and gender and egalitarian belief sets. And the strongest correlations were, I'll just show you these two, between the baseline people and African Americans here. You see there's a reversal here, that people who thought that African Americans voted for Obama because he was African American or black, they have a 0.337 correlation. That's a pretty strong correlation in survey research. But among people, it wasn't in the African American group. People get the benefit of the doubt, and their racial resentment is tied to malfeasance if they thought he was a better candidate. So what they're doing is giving whites an out and using their racial resentment to actually do that. So their own racial predispositions and beliefs say, well, we should penalize the group that we think is bad, and we'll give deference to the group that we think is good. We won't say that they said he was African American. There's no racial effect there. The effect is all about how we evaluate the group that did it. And if the group that did it is kind of race-free, there's no context to it, we show those significant effects. So that was the gist of the paper. Same thing with the correlation with whites. People who thought that whites voted for Obama because he was a better candidate, strong effect of racial resentment on perceptions of electoral malfeasance, right? But none when they said that whites thought they voted for him because he was African American. We don't penalize whites in that way. So what are some of the broader discussion points or things that we were asked to discuss? One, just thinking about people. There's an uncontrollable burden that kind of falls on some candidates. We've talked about this as well. You can remove candidates and put students in there, employees, applicants, whatever you want. Identity is the big filter there. And it doesn't matter if it's a racial identity, because I had a racial identity and told you something, and all of a sudden I was put into a different category. So the notion that, for example, just because one is black, everybody's on the same page, or woman, same page, we believe that and ignore the other differences that exist there. So when we talk about some of these appraisal errors and the like, it exists. So for example, I'm a dean. My two least diverse departments, Black American Studies and Women and Gender Studies. The principle of diversity applies whether you're within group or outside of group. We have no white majors in Black American Studies and no white faculty. We have no male faculty in Women and Gender Studies. And we have maybe, I think out of our majors, 3% are male in Women and Gender Studies. Women and Gender Studies, gender matters, right? And when we try and hire males into the department, it's a bit of a fight. So there are these contradictions that exist because we typically think the identity is one thing when it's actually something else operating underneath there. The idea of facts versus stereotypes, so facts in the support of different positions don't matter as much because people are motivated in their thinking. You're motivated, you know this, but you don't like to accept it in many cases. You're motivated to believe what you already agree with, right? So if I make an argument that's counter to that, that's too much, right? And you're automatic in that action. We can't stop it, we can't control it. So a disagreement comes about faster than an agreement. Agreement you accept and you wait for something bad to happen, status quo versus random things. So stereotypes and facts play a role in our thinking as well. You know this, but motivated reasoning is very important. And I think about the implications for social work. Again, going back to rights, that when you're requesting a right to something or you're demanding a right to something, fundamentally there's an assumption that you don't have it and somebody else does, and you're asking for it to be applied equally, or you're asking for it to be given. Then the group instantly has the power to give or not give, and they realize that. And in many cases, they're going to try and set the criteria for passing out and handing out that right or not. They may not even have control over it, but they've been given that power through the very basic argument of saying we don't have it. It's very subtle, it's a very psychological effect, but it's still there, and it becomes a part of the debate, right? So if I'm a dean and I have faculty lines and somebody comes and they ask for it, you've got the faculty lines in your department. You're now making a case for what kinds of faculty you should get. But they still have to come to me to ask, and that gives me an implicit authority, right? Even if it's real or not. The last thing about, and I talk about that through my research on voter ID laws, felon voting, equal education, equal opportunities, and the like, and how people kind of resent the asking of something that they feel like they should already be getting, or that a group should already has, but they're not taking advantage of the opportunities they have, right? These kind of weird narratives like there are no structural constraints out there, and that individualism is the dominant idea. That's American political culture, right? Using public opinion, survey methods, and different experimental features help to make these arguments. So when I used to work, I worked at Gallup for 10 years, and we used to do briefings for the White House and Congress on different issues. We would randomize the order of very basic questions. And my very first publication was about affirmative action. And we'd randomize the order of two questions. Do you support affirmative action for women? Do you support affirmative action for racial minorities? Randomized version, just flip the order. Do you support affirmative action for racial minorities than women? Women were always penalized in the context of thinking about racial minorities. And racial minorities benefited from being thought about in the context of gender. So these informational effects matter, but they don't operate in a vacuum. So when you're talking about educating the public, guess what happens? They go home, they turn on the television. They go home, they go back to their communities, and they get counter narratives and counter information. So everything you tell them is being countered and chipped away. Every good story or good message about the Affordable Care Act is being hammered by another message over here. And you know what the public does? They check out. They get, where's my psychologist in the room? So we talked about the vetoing of the mind and how when you're inebriated, when you're stressed and you're tired, when you drank too much, you can't put up the front anymore. Your brain just stops, and that's what happens here in these political debates and arguments. So there are ways that we can get at this and make arguments that are pretty strong using public opinion data and experimental methods, just to show people about the malleability of opinion on issues and how people can be, their principled positions are not as principled as they think when they get different information, right? And so that's what my work is about, and that's what I think we can talk more about in social work context. Right. All right.
Well, actually,
We're gonna go. Oh,
Adam's gonna go, yeah.
oh, what was that about? Oh.
Slides.
Implicit power. So next one. All right. Okay, again, let me just echo, thank you so much for inviting us here and for organizing this, Kat and Dean Short and Dean Jackson and others. And so, and also thank you too for putting me on the politics panel. My research in part looks at economics, but it really is sort of a political sort of project. It's an intersection of politics and economics. So I'll go over, talk real brief. So I guess I want to sort of talk about the ghetto tax, basically, or a sense of quarantine consumers who are sort of quarantined in part by geography, which is often served as a proxy for race through something called postal code profiling or politically correct profiling. It's increasingly not sort of politically correct to profile by race and age and gender, but it's still very acceptable to profile by postal code, by zip code, and so, and the impact that it has on wealth transfer in the U.S. This is basically a part of my book, which will be coming out later this year. My book has sort of 4 parts to it. It's about the rise of consumer finance fees and the ways in which it impacts all Americans, but has an acute impact on racial communities. And these fees rise not simply in any sort of sphere, but they primarily rise in spheres of upward mobility, housing, education, employment, and in transportation. And so we're going to look at that sort of last sort of sphere now, because transportation kind of connects us, gets us to home, to school, to work, anywhere west of the Hudson River. Well, it's the car, auto insurance. And so look at this housing. When the first sort of financial deregulation laws sort of passed, the aim and objective, this gets part to what you were saying, David. The argument that was put forward was that financial deregulation in housing, and mortgage lending specifically, was designed to increase, to boost the savings for the average American. And so what happened, they passed this law called DIDMA, that's just the abbreviation of it. And DIDMA was supposed to lift the interest rate caps so that once a lender goes out and sells a mortgage, they can put more money, ultimately more money winds up in the average bank account holders. That law was passed in 1980, and we can see the great drop in savings rates of Americans. And so my basic point here is if the primary original intent of financial deregulation was to increase the savings for the average American account holder, then this law is fundamentally flawed. It needs to be sort of revisited. And of course, as I said before, laws like financial deregulation and mortgage industry has a sort of disparate impact upon Black communities, as well as Latino communities as well. And we could also talk about the impact that the mortgage crisis has also on Asian Americans who were the wealthiest per capita in the U.S. prior to the mortgage collapse, and then after the collapse, they fell that category. Second area of research looks at issues of education, particularly higher education. The big thing is just pay attention to the blue in these pie charts, basically. The blue represents the percentage of what grants used to cover of a college, of a college education. In 1979, 1978, grants cover roughly two-thirds of a college education. By 2006, 7, it covered 1/3 of a college education. Increasingly, student loans came to sort of take over the roles of grants, and this didn't happen by accident, basically. In the 1980s, there was an active argument, and you guys can't read that. You can just read what's in the quotes there. There was an active argument in the Reagan administration about the roles of grant money in financing upper mobility among blacks. So it's a conscious conversation they're having. Liz Dole writes this sort of memo in response, warning that if you roll back grants, it's going to have a disparate impact upon communities of color in terms of their ability to be upwardly mobile. The administration sort of ignores that and increases lending and rolls back again the grant program. This comes out of the Reagan Presidential Library. And again, so ultimately, who winds up borrowing? African Americans wind up borrowing much more so than any other community. How other sort of charts here pressed for time, we'll see that both blacks and Latinos not simply wind up borrowing, or more likely to borrowing, they also wind up borrowing more. And they also wind up borrowing more, not simply more, but what's called unmanageable debt within the mortgage lending industry. So again, these policies are universal, but they have a disparate impact upon communities of color. That's the bigger point. And so in the sort of the last thing my research sort of looks at is, as you guys sort of read, you've read the chapter, Proposition 103, the rise of auto insurance. You can see here, in the 1980s, should be CPI there, sorry. In the 1980s, increasingly auto insurance is rising for the average motorists, particularly in California, rising much faster than the rate of inflation. And because of the rise of auto insurance, it really sort of triggers a response from the public and public backlash, and something called Proposition 103, which gets passed in 1988. Proposition 103 was designed to roll back, as you guys have sort of read, using zip code as a primary factor for determining auto rates. You see here, this is what auto insurance used to help determine rates, and sort of goes all the way back to Arlene's sort of conversation about environment, various ways to look at environment. Here's the imagined environment of what makes a community, and that imagined environment is mapped onto something called zip codes. And so, zip code is a primary factor used to determine auto insurance, whether one's marital status as well. You're more likely to be charged more in auto insurance. How much one sort of drives. And so auto insurance is not predicated, baseline is that auto insurance is not predicated upon the merit of the motorist. And we can understand what the merit of a motorist is. Do I get into accidents? Do I get tickets? How much do I drive? We live in a society that's essentially predicated on merit, except when it comes to these sorts of spheres, and sort of trying to tease out why in this particular sphere and not other spheres like higher education does not matter as we tell it, as you told us, so important. And again, this is, like I said before, it's linked to what I call PC profiling, postal code profiling. Urban motorists pay as much as $900 or more per year for their auto insurance rates. And I'll say this too. I don't think this is actually in the chapter, but economists, and urban sociologists, and others talked about the need for reliable transportation in order to get employment. So this is sort of mapped onto issues of employment. And that if you go for a job and you don't have reliable transportation, you're far less likely to be employed. Not simply far less likely to be employed, but you're also far less likely to be able to get a pay raise, get a promotion. And so, again, having reliable transportation, by reliable transportation, what the employer is talking about is, do I have a car? Not do I take the metro, not do I take the bus, but do I own my own car? And so again, this has a sort of cascading effect on employment, and employment obviously has a cascading effect on things like being able to buy a mortgage, being able to buy a house and home. And we see here that America's most famous zip code, 90210, they pay approximately $500 less than the nation's sort of poorest sort of zip codes. And $500 a year annually may not seem like much, but let's skip right here. $400 to $500 is what the Federal Reserve in its last report last year says the amount of money that nearly half of Americans don't have to cover an emergency expense. And you can extrapolate from that and imagine that if the poorest zip codes are being charged more, $500 more perhaps in 90210, that space, that community has even less money to be able to afford emergency expenses. So where do they go? They go to the payday lender. And if you know anything about payday lending, it's kind of like bloodletting, right? Well, more like bloodletting where the cure is worse than the disease, right? If studies of payday lending basically shows that you're far more likely to actually wind up in bankruptcy if you take out a payday loan than if you don't. So if you go to a payday lender for some reason, they deny you that loan, you're actually better off. You're less likely to wind up in bankruptcy. So again, these things have sort of cascading effects throughout these four spheres of upward mobility in America. And what helps to perpetuate this territorial rating system is what's called sort of regulatory capture. And regulatory capture basically happens when the financial industry or any kind of corporate interest basically dictates and controls what happens in regulatory policy. And here you have the insurance commissioner, a guy named Quackenbush, and he basically becomes sort of very responsive to the insurance industry. Now here, taxpayers have a hand in this as well. Why? Because up until real recently in the state of California, the insurance commissioner's his job, his office, was funded solely by the private sector. And so this gets a bit back to the notions of the shadow state that Jennifer Wallach sort of talks about, that if these things are important to us, then we need to fund them. If higher education is important to us, we need to fund them. And if having merit in auto insurance is important, then we need to fund them. And otherwise, we wind up being captives of big corporate interests. And that's it, I believe. Yeah. So.
Thank you.
No, right.
Nice.
Thanks. So I just want to echo my thanks for being invited and being able to take part in this really innovative and interdisciplinary conversation. So just a little bit of a background about myself. I was originally trained as a psychologist, and so some of the earlier work that I've done, and I don't have that much work because I'm fairly junior in academia, was looking more at perspectives around diversity in organizations from an individual space. And it was when I got to my dissertation that diversity, particularly in organizational behavior, focuses mostly on what goes on inside of an organization and doesn't really take into consideration context. And so we've had some really great conversations about, place and how interactions with communities might then inform our own identities. And what I've done in this work in particular is I know from my own experience, growing up in New York, I was the same person, but when I moved to New Orleans, it felt different, racially, ethnically, to be me in that environment. I now live in Salt Lake City. As you can imagine, feels completely different being who I am, going from New Orleans to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and then now in Utah. So that's kind of what my some of the motivation for the work that I've done. So here, when I started thinking more about communities, I really like this quote from Franklin Roosevelt, who talks about how in some communities employers dislike to employ women, and others they are reluctant to hire Negroes. We can no longer afford to indulge such prejudices and practices. And this was at the time when we were, engaging in a world war. And what was interesting about this is that, by all accounts, we were fighting for equality abroad when the, United States military was still segregated, as was the American workplace. So being in a business school now, you know, I have to make this case, and I don't need to make it in a space like this, that discrimination and inequality are still real problems, especially around, you know, race and gender in particular. A lot of the data that I've gotten has been from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, right? And so this is the oversight agency that collects data on things like how, you know, minorities and women are, you know, in certain roles in organizations. So not only is it, I think from a social justice perspective, still a very important issue, but some of the conversations that, you know, we were having earlier was really about how businesses and other types of institutions can make a case for why diversity should matter, right? And so, and I think that might be something that hopefully we can get back to later. Yes, we can have the numbers in terms of, you know, checking boxes with respect to minorities and women, but I think that only, you know, trying to say, well, we have this type of diversity and it leads to these types of outcomes, I think that we are losing the social justice aspect, because what happens if, you know, as the provost said earlier in the case that was made earlier, if it's the case that we're saying, well, if we have this type of diversity, this is how it's going to translate into all of these great outcomes, whether it's, you know, a better financial outcome, what happens when you can't make that link anymore, right? So then do we say, well, since it doesn't make business sense, and this is what's been happening particularly in corporations, there's been this, rather than, you know, saying we need justice for justice sakes, it's, well, what's this business case for diversity and how can this translate to our bottom line? Well, what if you can't have the data to support that? Is diversity then on the chopping block? So I think that's something that we need to pay attention to. So the perspective that I take specifically is looking at how organizations are situated in geographic spaces and how those geographic spaces then affect how people are interacting with one another inside of the workplace. And I think some of the overlap, particularly with social work, is at the end of the day, people are, you know, living, they're breathing in these geographic contexts, and they don't stop being those individuals once they go to work, right? And so if you know, organizations are, you know, employing lots of different individuals who are then having to relate with one another, it's not that much of a stretch for, you know, for somebody who's studying organizations to say, well, these really important, you know, relationships are going to be the lifeblood of the economy, right? And so I think that's why there's a nice overlap with social work. So in particular, in terms of the contributions of the work that I do, is that there's been this overwhelming focus on internal workplace conditions and trying to figure out, you know, how do we eradicate or minimize inequality inside of organizations, right? And so the perspective that I take, though, is, again, there are going to be these outside influences that kind of seep into and spill over into organizations. And so that's what I very much try to do, is take into consideration the space and the relationships and the ideologies in local communities that then are going to impact how individuals are related with one another inside of the workplace. So, I mean, I focus specifically on race and sex segregation. And so again, if we're talking about, you know, what are the numbers of minorities or women that are in organizations, it's not good enough to say, well, let's say we have a workplace that's 50% female or it's 50% black. Well, what happens when, let's say, all of that diversity on paper translates into, you know, maybe these are individuals who are at the bottom rung of the ladder inside of organizations, right? So we're not really, if these types of individuals are being segregated and relegated to lower rungs of the ladder inside of organizations, you can then think about how that's going to affect things like, you know, wages, the amount of authority that you can have in an organization. If these are not individuals who are breaking the glass ceiling, and getting into higher levels inside of organizations, that's going to have, you know, disparate impact in terms of the money that they're making, which, you know, going to Devin's point, the ability to pay for emergency costs and things of that nature. So this was outside of a housing project in Detroit in the 1940s. And so what's interesting, and I think what it would be helpful for organizational scholars to take from other disciplines in particular, and also in particular social work, is that, again, there's a very important aspect of geographic communities that, again, is going to spill over into organizations. And we know from psychology and sociology and political science that particularly as it relates to intergroup relations, we know that space matters, right? And context is gonna matter. A lot of times when, you know, from a more sociological standpoint, when we're taking into consideration space and race in particular, it's usually, the research is typically looked at, let's say the percentage of, let's say, blacks in a given geographic area, which has been related to things like lynchings or homicide arrests. Unfortunately, when I first started this project, I had support for David Duke like it was something of the past, and now that's obviously, he has resurfaced in a most unfortunate sense. But actually in Louisiana, which is where I used to live, the parishes that had greater numbers of African Americans were also those parishes that had greater support for David Duke, right? And so there's obviously a well-documented relationship between, you know, intergroup relations, the demographic composition of these communities, and a whole host of outcomes. There's also been a strong influence, specifically in the organizational context, you know, things like corporate governance practices, creativity and innovation, and also how we perceive conflict in our workplaces and the types of relationships that we have in organizations. And so, I mean, how I already set up the talk was that, again, individuals are going to have this social baggage that they're getting from other contexts, and my work explores what might be some of the baggage that they're coming to from the geographic communities where they're residing and also working. And so I think it's nice to be on a panel, this specific panel, because I look at things like the political ideology in a given area, also looking at the legal environment, and also just what might be some normative, you know, ideologies that are present in a geographic community. So rather than looking at, let's say, the state level, even for me living in Salt Lake City, that's very different. Salt Lake is very different from Provo, if you guys have any idea what Provo is like. Or Austin, Texas is going to be, it feels really different than Dallas or San Antonio, right? So trying to drill down and looking more at the communities where organizations are embedded. And what's interesting is that, and I know my paper was sent out late, some of the factors that I look at as it relates to occupational segregation in organizations, the strongest factors that I've shown to mitigate inequality inside of organizations was political ideology. So in communities where there's a greater percentage of people who are, you know, have voted in the past as Democrats, the more liberal leaning folks, there are significantly lower levels of occupational segregation by both race and sex. Interestingly enough, and I think that this is timely, in communities where there are also greater numbers of immigrants, writ large, however you want to define that, but I'm looking at data from the census, those are also communities where there are lower levels of occupational segregation. So it seems like there are fairer workplaces in terms of how people are siphoned into their jobs with these two particular characteristics. So again, I mean, if we're not thinking about organizations in a vacuum and we're really lending credence to the space where these organizations are located, you can think about, again, this geographic space being made up of these different types of relationships that, you know, people have with one another, whether it's inside or outside of the workplace. And so zooming out of the organization and looking at a higher level at these geographic communities, you can see how it's a really nice intersection of legal, political, also normative influences, and also the social structures that are going to then influence how people relate to each other inside of organizations. And so just as you can tell, community does matter. And so these are levels of occupational segregation, specifically by race, across U.S. communities. By most national aggregates, we see that there's actually has not been much progress made since the 1980s, and most people say it's because of Ronald Reagan in particular, and how the types of appointees that he made to district courts and also to the Supreme Court, so how law has been interpreted and enacted. But again, I don't think that tells the whole picture if you're just looking at these more national aggregates, because we can obviously see that certain areas are going to be, you know, potentially pockets of, inequality, or, bastions of fair labor practices and things of that nature. I think what's going to be more important as we, especially for organizational scholars, looking at this, social construction of race as, has been the conversation today. We know that inequality is a social process, right? It's not I mean, going back to your point, Devin, about merit, you know, promotions and hiring and selection and those types of things into organizations is clearly not only based on merit, right? We, especially organizational decision makers, are still human beings, right? There's still the same set of biases. There's still the same set of stereotypes and assumptions that we make about certain people coming from certain areas or different walks of life. So I think what I would like to move into particularly, and this will open up the conversation that we can have more broadly, is, you know, how are organizations potential instruments for change? And I don't mean, you know, I think when people think about firms and organizations that it's necessarily these for-profit organizations, and that's not really the case. I think, and maybe this is because I'm an organizational scholar, I think that, you know, individuals are part of some form or fashion of organizations, whether it's, you know, the place where you work or the church that you attend. These are still organizing structures. And so some of the initial anti-discrimination laws were specifically in the context of work, because people are going to work every day. It affects us in a whole host of manners. And so the federal legislation was looking particularly at, well, if we can desegregate the workplace, maybe this will have, you know, broader implications for how people are living, the wages that they're making, the types of activities that they can then engage in. And so thinking about now as we move forward, how might it be that the organizations can be potential instruments for change? And so I don't know if you guys remember the Starbucks and their Race Together campaign, and well-intentioned, probably, you know, I think most people would say it was poorly executed, but still, you know, these are ways that, you know, what we think are these amoral entities can actually affect real change. Because if we're thinking back to where the money is, if you have, you know, firms pulling out of Indiana because of religious freedom laws, or if you've got the NFL saying that they're not going to host a Super Bowl, or the NCAA and other NBA All-Star Week was pulled out of North Carolina in protest of the bathroom bill in North Carolina, I think that that's where we have this nice intersection of economic power, you know, through organizations, and how that can potentially affect social change. So I took this from the National Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics, and where I think there are particularly nice overlaps between organizational studies and social work, again, addressing these social problems around race and also gender and other challenges with, you know, historically defined categories that are of folks who are in the minority or experiencing disadvantage. I think more and more organizations are looking at, you know, how they can potentially address social injustices. If we also think about the dignity and worth of the person, that doesn't stop, again, when you go into go through the doors of the place where you work. So I think that also is a nice opportunity for there to be this work going forward between social work and organizational studies. Also behaving in a trustworthy manner. I think, you know, in the last 20 years in particular, there's been this major distrust of lots of different institutions, but also the workplace, especially for for-profit organizations. A lot of people in the public assume that because if an organization is trying to maximize its bottom line, that they're going to be willing to do anything in their power in order to increase that bottom line. And I think now there's been, especially in the last 10 years or so, this move towards more ethical types of practices, behaving in a more trustworthy manner. And so I think some issues around ethics and human dignity we can actually borrow from work in the area of social work. So I'd like to open it up, I guess, to discussion.
Thanks so much. So hopefully we still got energy. I know we've been at it for a while. Sure.
Just a quick announcement. Do you want me to make it?
In a little bit, if lunch wasn't enough to fill your bellies, we'll be opening the doors, and please, don't stop the discussion, just, there'll be a tea in there, and
Tea and crumpets.
Thank you.
You know, the ghetto tax discussion reminds me and connects directly to the profiling discussion we had this morning. They're both the same thing. There's no difference between the two analyses at all. In both cases, You're making judgments on the basis of allegedly statistical generalizations about statistical linkages between a membership in a particular category and behavior you're trying to predict on the basis of that membership. No difference, right? And we run into the same problem. The same justifications for racial profiling that people advance to support it. And some of those are tough arguments to get around, like when Jesse Jackson starts to do it, right? It's hard to get around. They're the same ones that you see here. They say, look, and I teach torts, accident law.
Okay.
That's what I do, right? So I think about risk all the time, risk assessments, actuarial risk, and premiums, right? Yeah. And what you find is it's a hard truth that the actuarialists anyway are telling me when I sit down and have some Jack Daniels with them, is that the fact of the matter is, black and white, poor blacks represent the highest statistical risk of accidents. Next is poor whites. Next is middle class and upper class whites. You know who the safest drivers are? The most risk-free, rather lowest risk drivers are? Middle class blacks. So we're both at the bottom end and at the top end in terms of risk assessments. And some of that may have to do with, you know, the fear of status slippage that we have, the 10 and 2 phenomenon. Once you finally made it, you know, you're going to be hyper risk averse, right? And do a lot of, but my concern is that if you can explain the higher accident rate of low-income blacks as a reality, that's not just a fiction. You know, if it was a fiction, we could get around it.
Can I interject? Absolutely right. But evidence also shows it still doesn't explain the size of the gap.
We can get into the size, but you know, there's going to be a gap. Yeah. We're not going to be able to deny. I'm saying there's some things we go in and deny them, and you lose your credibility, right? When the discussions I'm having over there, when you start denying the math, you know, when they say, look, people who are 16 and 17 have much higher accident rates than people who are 30 and 40. They just do.
Well, I mean, that's...
So I just want to get through all that.
Well, I mean, 16 or 17, that's why, I mean, in terms of the merit of a motorist, how long you've been driving. That's a factor.
But I'm saying, once you get... what I'm saying is, that factor, both age and gender and race, are connected to risk.
Sure.
Right? I just want to, can I get that acknowledgement? It seems like you want to say no, they're not.
You know why? Because I don't know, for me, I don't necessarily always agree with all the data that comes out, because that in and of itself, we already seen this. They do that at UCLA all the time. We don't do that here at USC. But there is an argument, seriously, for we can make data say whatever we want it to say. I'm not saying that's not the case.
You might as well not have any discussions with better database then.
Jody,
because we'll always say the data we can't trust.
But that's true, Jody.
Jody, I agree with you.
But okay, so let's go beyond that. Once we get that agreement, I just want to get that agreement. Once we get that agreement, can we just get that?
No.
Right? And we can't run. You're
not all the time.
I'm not saying
I'm saying, would you allow for...
I don't want to nitpick on all the time. Okay. I'm talking about some general, broad social issues and policies that we've been grappling with that do have real statistical differences.
But they actually say,
that matter.
Yeah, the more accurate predictor of risk is not zip code, is place location. Right? Market location. So do you live near a bar or do you live near a school? And if you live near a bar or school, you live near a school or a church, let's say, you're much less likely to get into accidents as opposed to if you live near a bar. And so place markers
are actually lots of factors, right? I'm saying one of the factors is going to be race.
Yeah, but
one of the factors is going to be gender when it comes to the prison population. It's a 10-to-1 ratio, folks. It's not close. If someone is coming close to me on the sidewalk at night and I'm thinking about them, if I consider their gender, that's going to make a big difference in the risk assessment. It just does. Okay? Right. And so I don't want to argue about that so much as to say, once we acknowledge that gender matters, for example, the risk assessment when it comes to crime, or gender or race really does have a statistically significant effect on your driving record typically. I just want to get to that point. When we get there, so we don't keep coming back and arguing that
because
over
there's
and
a
over.
bit of a
Race
fallacy.
as a proxy for other things.
Right,
is
right.
really what it is. But I think that
So you can't, right.
what I think, yes, that's the argument. You're right. The argument is statistical discrimination, and that there's efficiency to it. It's efficiency enhancing, right? But I think where the bias comes in is if you control. Once you control for those things, when you still have an effect that remains, then that's where you have the argument for
Exactly.
what is it? It's something more than just the differences in the rates of these groups committing this type of
We
thing.
can do all that.
Right?
And those folks will, the good arguers, they'll acknowledge all that and say, I want to just talk about not the residuals that are left over, that are distortions we can't account for. There are real differences otherwise between age, between race, between gender in driving that you can see, and then you can get into all of that other stuff too.
I don't think you can, not particularly with
there are
race.
real differences. I'll get to
disagree.
that in a moment because you know, you're just disagreeing with the way that the numbers people come in and they will crush you. I'm just telling you, I've been in too many situations which you will be crushed in a public forum if you come in saying math doesn't matter, numbers don't matter, I don't trust any methodology. They're going to say, what methodology of yours should we trust in? A lot of the information you're gathering on systematic bias is based on statistical analysis. Most of your evidence is actuarial, really, in a lot of discrimination context. That's what you bring up, right? You make your arguments with numbers, so you can't, you can't just say numbers are,
Nobody's saying that.
numbers
Nobody's
not
saying
to
that,
be
but
trusted.
it's
all
not
I'm
a
saying is
blanket.
once we acknowledge that
No,
there
Jody.
is this connection.
No.
What? Okay, I'm just going to everyone else who wants to acknowledge that there is a connection.
Nobody agrees with you.
Nobody agrees with
Yeah, I think-
Okay, good. That's what I'm saying. I'm really saying, if you go
No, you're
down
missing-
that
you're
road,
missing what I'm saying.
you're going to undermine the credibility of the position as such. That's what happens in these discussions. All right.
Yeah.
So I'm saying once you acknowledge that, you see how long it takes us to get to that acknowledgement because there is
Because
this
there's
kind of
something
resistance.
fundamentally
But once you
skewed about it.
acknowledge
That's
that,
why.
which I've had to, that's what my first book did. I had to get in there and say, okay, you acknowledge this, you acknowledge it, and you figure out what their main argument is, and then you go after that.
Yeah.
Their main argument, once you get rid of all that, the main argument is that you take a group of people in society and you disproportionately concentrate them in desperate circumstances so that they feel disproportionately put up on. Right? I'm constantly being put up on as a black man getting up. I can't go down to J.W. Marriott without getting I can go through that story without getting sweated and all kinds of other places, right? When you're constantly feeling put up on, that may express itself in your driving behavior. You may drive more aggressively. And that may result in a different driving risk.
Yeah, race as a proxy.
Right,
Race
right,
as a
right,
proxy for other things.
right. But
Yeah.
what I'm saying,
That's Arlene's point.
right. But what I'm saying is then once you got that, once you acknowledge that, then when you go for the proxies that are going to get you around race, you say, well, we don't want to deal directly with race, even though the racial experience I'm having, the racial oppression I'm suffering is what's leading to my worst driving record because it's making me feel more put upon and more aggressive, so it's connected to the higher risk I run. Once you acknowledge all that, then you see the problem with proxies. Because as soon as you go to a proxy, which you're going to do, you're going to say, we can't do race. You told us we can't do race. The legislature said to me, you can't use race. You can't use this or that, right? You're going to look for a proxy or surrogate. When you go to that proxy or surrogate, you go to zip code, you go to the kind of music you listen to. They find all kinds of proxies for age and race, et cetera, right? What you find is that, or let's go to driving record. I'll go to your favorite, the best one, the pure merit one, the driving record, right? The fact of the matter is, if blacks or those who are disproportionately by society put up on have a more aggressive, higher accident rate, right, then if you go by the merit, the accident rate, you're still going to wind up disproportionately burdening, having higher premiums paid by this group of people who has a higher accident rate
But
because
you're
they
still
have
putting,
that background.
I don't like it because you're still putting the burden of,
Right? You
you're
see
still putting
that,
the burden
right?
on the victim. That's
Can
not
I
what he.
clarify what I was saying? I was agreeing with you that race is picking up these other things. That's what I meant by race as a proxy for other things. Not that, yes, you're right. If you say you can't, for example, one example of that is criminal records. If you say you can't check criminal records, one unintended consequence of that might be okay, now they might start statistically discriminating, and I'll just use race as a proxy for criminal background. And so actually what happens is you get less black men being hired than what you would think because of the connection that people make between criminality and race. Absolutely. Right? So yes, that is right. If you say, okay, we can't use race, then they'll start using those other things that are identifiable, that are sort of that might be connected. But when I was saying race is picking up a lot of other things about an individual circumstance that that might lead to the differences in any sort of behavioral outcomes. And I think that's what your point was,
which
right?
Doesn't change, right? Which I'm fine with. What Jesse Jackson says, I understand all that. When I say that the thing that most troubles me at this point in my life is to hear the suspicious footsteps, turn around, see a white face, and feel relieved, he would say, yeah, I understand that the reason for that is because of systemic oppression and discrimination, and black folks are impoverished at a different rate. At the end of the day, though, when I have to make that call on the street, on the basis of very little information, I have limited information set, I have to use some heuristics and make some quick judgment calls, I'm going to use that factor, right? And what I'm saying is when we tell people you can't use that factor, when we eliminate that factor, right, they find the surrogates and the proxies, and they may wind up just reinforcing it in another way, when what we could do is what we do in torts when it comes to people who generate extra risk. In the tort process, we have ways of dealing with this, right? We have people who generate more than ordinary risk. For example, people with physical handicaps. When they get behind the wheel of a car, they generate more than the ordinary risk that people without prosthetic devices do. What the law does is hold them to a lower standard. We hold them to the standard of a person with a prosthetic. So they aren't, the gap between the risk that the rest of us pose and the risk they pose is closed by holding them to the lower standard, so their premiums don't go up. They pose a higher risk, but they're made access to core community activities are open to them because we don't impose a financial burden on them that their risk really justify. So that's one way, but that's hard for us to do in this context because we'd have to say we need a lower standard, a black person standard versus a white person standard. We know that's going to get a lot of pushback. So the other way you can solve that problem is not by lowering the standard of care, which you could do, or lowering the credit threshold, or whatever, changing the standard itself. You can directly subsidize. Right? You can say, we're going to give, from tax dollars, black drivers an additional amount of money to go out and buy insurance in the market. That way we don't have to lower the standard, and the amount that they risk, that they the amount that they're kept out of participating in core community activities because they pose a higher risk, that's reduced because we're directly subsidizing their participation in these core community activities. Now that also is a little trick. You got to sell it to the politicians and other people, but you get you around some of the issues.
Wait a minute. Okay, I hear what you're saying. All right, subsidy and all that stuff. I get that. But I think what he was saying, for instance, if you are in impoverished areas, there tend to be more liquor stores. There tend to be more of these things that get in the way of that. What you're suggesting to me is really what is thinking like this dominant social structure. Let's figure out a way that we can sort of ameliorate some of these issues with these poor Negroes that just can't seem to drive properly. When in actuality, if all things being equal, even with race, if we made it white and put the same sort of location and living conditions exactly the same and controlled for all of that, you'd probably find the exact same driving record. It has nothing to do.
The fact of the matter is, lower income whites do not have the same crime rates as lower income blacks. They just don't. They don't have, nor do lower class Latinos, right? And we can go into all the factors. So that may not just controlling for all the external social.
I don't know what the statistical difference for that is, but I mean, it's fair to say that there's a problem. For instance, with the Irish, I saw that you had the Irish up there, like no Irish at one time. I remember when the Irish first came here, there was this PBS, you saw that. And it looked like it was the black community. It was the exact same thing, because poverty in any color is going to basically give you the same result.
That's not, I'm telling you, I do criminological stuff all the time. That just isn't the, you know, I wish it were the case. I would make my arguments a lot easier when I'm going against Bill O'Reilly and some of these conservatives. It really would. It's just not, factually you'll get blown out the water, I'm just telling you.
Well, I think the reason is because
the raw numbers, but when you dissect them a little more, because I wonder if the same thing still holds up when you look at whites in urban settings versus blacks in urban settings. If you still have the same.
You do. It is a humongous difference, and it's why
who are the
race
police?
matters. Race makes a difference in our experience.
Who's prosecuting?
Oh, I hear you. A lot of times it's black folks who want the additional prosecution. You know, it's black folks who passed the tougher laws. They were, when I was running up against Randall Kennedy in 1997 when he wrote Race, Crime, and Law, and I just written Negrophobia, and he was arguing that the black community needs to practice a politics of respectability whereby we distinguish and distance ourselves from black criminals and all that sort of thing.
You understand what that's about ultimately?
Yeah, but he could come in and point to the polls that they did of the black community in 1996 and 7. I remember him sitting there and I'm like, man, that's a tough number to get around, showing that 75% of the black community in 97, 98 wanted more prisons built and longer sentences. This is not just white folks imposing this. This is black people, right? This is the politics of respect. Bill Cosby standing up there in 2004 getting into the war was reflecting that mentality, you know.
And that's
why was he taking that pound cake from the store? The people complain about him getting a bullet in the head. He shouldn't have taken the pound cake, right? That's in our community. That's not them imposing that on us.
Well, that's in our community, but it's informed by the level of racism that we have seen since Jim Crow all the way back.
We're not puppets on a string. We're not putty. We have agency. We have minds. We're not infants.
But we are impacted.
Don't have to be infantilized.
But please, we are impacted by it all.
Sure, we're impacted, but
as
we
is
have
the rest of
responsibility
society.
too.
And there's media, and there's all these other entities that move it. I'm sorry.
The question is, does it matter who's doing what? Like, does it matter that African Americans are also lobbying for the same legislation? Because ultimately what ends up happening is that we still end up with the same outcome and the same social hierarchy, because it could be that those communities don't quite understand the ramification of that choice. They think that if we can get rid of the crime, we can maybe attract economic growth and all these other things. But maybe they don't understand that in the long run, they're increasing crime, because then they're now stigmatizing the individuals in their society so that they can't get jobs, and you're causing intergenerational transmission of, for example, incarceration. So part of that could be that those communities don't quite understand. They want an immediate fix for a long-run solution, because the solution is really inequality. And there's plenty of evidence, there's research that has found that is try to disentangle the causality, that inequality leads to increases in violent behavior and other crimes and property crimes, right? So I think if those things were understood across the board, then it wouldn't really matter, right? It doesn't matter who's arguing for what legislation, just the impact of the legislation is, I guess, what I'm saying. Does it matter who's arguing for what legislation?
It depends on what the finding is. I mean, because if it's an issue of someone not understanding, the implications have something to do with raising awareness. If someone is fully aware and still making a certain decision, voting a certain way, then you might want to change their understanding.
Yeah, so it might
but it's not
affect
about
how you go about,
or even whether you
fixing,
go about.
Yeah. Well, I think the not being educated, if you're not educated on the ramifications of a particular decision, once you become educated, you might choose to do something differently, right?
Right.
But then for the person who is educated and they just don't really care, because it doesn't relate, it doesn't relate to them, and maybe they're benefiting from the prisons that are being built in their communities, then you know,
we need to understand.
Huh?
Then we need to understand what.
Then that's a totally different, you know, because at one point prisons were used as economic growth in rural communities, right?
Yeah, but that was until the mid-90s. You have in the mid-80s, you have the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act. I always hear about this prison-for-profit move. That move doesn't come until the mid-90s and later. We'd already had the explosion in the prison population.
it's cities wanting to build prisons for employment because of the drying up of manufacturing.
Right, that came in the 90s is what I'm saying.
Which is when the prison boom peaked.
Right,
Yeah.
that came in the 90s. But the
it was set
reason
in
for the
place in
prison
the
boom
70s.
came before profits for prison. It came in the 1986 the crack plague.
Right.
The crack plague preceded
But
all
more
that.
the Omnibus Crime Act
Right.
that happened in the 90s as well.
Right, with
also
Bill Clinton. But it
Bill-
started in 86, right? You go to the crack plague, you see the spike. The numbers don't lie.
Well,
No, men lie,
and
women lie.
now,
You see the
and
spikes
now
in
you're
85,
bringing
86,
up,
87,
now
88.
you're bringing up another argument because now you're bringing up something where you're bringing up an area where blacks and whites use at the same level, but
The disparity
the
over
disparity
the,
is tremendous between who was sent to
Sentenced,
prison and who
and we're
wasn't.
seeing
So
in-
now and that's an even stronger argument
Right.
though to show any sort of racial disparity or inequality there.
It's clear to see the racial bias
because
collectively
you don't
with
have that
people.
efficiency argument, right?
Right.
You don't have that. Okay, me profiling this person helps me to detect a criminal, because actually they were using and selling at, if they're using and selling at the same rates, then it appears that the motivation was targeted, right? So you
Here's
have
what
more.
Randy Kennedy said to that. They all had answers to this. And Randy Kennedy stated that very simply, crack does more damage in the black community than white powder cocaine does in the white community. That's the reason why we crack down on it more. You don't have the death, you don't have the toe tags associated with powder coke that you have with crack, you don't have the gang activity. They go right down that road. And you have to be ready to address that. And it's not an easy one to address. That's a tough argument to address.
So I could say that making crack illegal is what actually caused those drug the
Black
violence.
people wanted it illegal. We went, when they did the
no,
polls,
no,
we
actually,
wanted it illegal.
Well, what about heroin right now?
Yeah.
We're facing the exact same thing with heroin right now, but it's a disease.
Sure, that's because
The criminal
white
it's
folks-
been
white folks- it's mainly
because
white kind of
it's
thing,
been
yeah.
decriminalized, and so I mean it's just silly to get around to pretend like race is not at the fundamental of the fundamental foundation of all of this. And I'm not disagreeing with you. Sometimes you scare me because it feels I'm like, which side are you on? Are you making a case for them, or are
an
you?
argument that's going to stand up to critical scrutiny, and I'm not on the
But I don't
side
know
of an
that-
argument that will get flattened and pancake and flapjack like I've seen these arguments for years do. I'm just telling you.
But they're
you know, when we
fundamentally,
look out
but it's
here
a
in the-
fundamentally
One
racist
second, one second,
argument.
one second,
You
please.
don't need to.
Respectfully. Okay. I think we're really passionate about this, and we're all on the same page. I think in a lot of sense.
I love Joe.
But I know you do. But we came here for a reason. Let's try to bring it back to the reason why we came here. To look at what do we do beyond on the next step? What do we do beyond those of us who are publishing, who are writing? We are aligned in a lot of understanding the system. What the barriers that are instilled. We have some sense of that. What do we do from here? How do we translate this to the next step? Because we can have this speaking to the choir and looking at nuances of different arguments, but what do we do next? We've been here before, where we've been in rooms like this before, and situations like this before. Now, this is imperative to take this and to move forward and to really affecting change in policy. So what is next?
I think that, don't start the topic again. I think that the fact of the matter is that often we don't get these interactions, do we? And these interactions, they are really, truly important to how we develop and how we view and see things. And I think that this is the first time, really, I've seen Robin in a passionate way, actually, and she's a good friend. I mean, in a way that, you know, because usually I think, oh, what is her view on the prison system, or what is her? And now I hear it. You know, I'm so proud. I mean, the whole fact of the matter is that often we don't have that conversation together. So although it, you know, Jody, I have conversation with all the time. Believe me, it's, you know, and he always touches my heart, because I think that you know, I've never ever seen something that I've disagreed with him.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell you why. Because the way he views it and see it, I can see too, being in politics and having a look at how people treat people of color is in every aspect of social policy. It's an absolute disgrace. It really is. And so, you know, sometimes you can't contain yourself in relation to that because it hurts so much. When you turn around and every aspect of it, you tell me a place in our lives that we have thrived. Go on, tell me somewhere. We don't. We constantly, socialization, our schools are rubbish. I mean, it goes from one end, health, we suffer, in the environment we live in, poor housing. You just go on and on and on. So I can understand that sometimes we feel really stressed out on these issues. But I think that what Terence is saying is that, you know, the thing about all of this too is that it's a strange thing, developing conversations, because sometimes you think, my God, I've heard this conversation before, but how do we move on out of this conversation? And the other thinking is that these conversations are so important because some of us haven't heard it for a while and we don't know where we're going. So on taking those two things together and pushing forward, my view is that we want to ensure that what we have turned up today, which is unique in itself to have so many people that have this passion, and that also, maybe passion isn't the word, well, have this commitment maybe to want to social justice and to want things to be changed in society, that this is a good time for us to focus and see what is the next step. We've all got good research around the table, and we've got good experience, haven't we? So how can we group together to take this to the next stage? What can we do? Now, the Dean is, I don't know if she's not here. I always do that because she sits there usually. The Dean talked about the grand challenges, and I have been talking to her about the grand challenges, and I was saying to John, the Dean is, and I'm sure other people in our school, we're all passionate about the grand challenges, and we can see that it's an opening for some sort of social change, okay? My thought is, how can we link that so that, with the grand challenges, so that other people can view and have discussions like this, and perhaps, you know, start something that is moving research with the idea that things in our community need changing. How do we do that? It's all right to, you know, the thing about theory, and I suppose because I come from the outside into university life, so I have a different perspective of how I view some issues. I do think that research is one of the most wonderful tools that is here at the university, but it's no good if it's not part and parcel of changing social policy. Agreed? We actually need, the discussion that we had here is such a meaningful discussion, but it doesn't really matter if it stays in this room, does it? No. So how do we take these things to make sure that we influence our community? How do we do that? And politicians, who we're voting for, like I was just telling Martel, you know, this morning on NPR, I learned that not the apostolics, but the
evangelical?
Yeah, that 81% of them actually voted for Trump. And majority of those people were people of color. Now, have you heard anything like that?
Yeah, that's probably wrong.
Huh? And then the argument goes further than that. The argument that was actually used why they voted for Trump was that one, that he would, you know, he is a businessman. They're struggling in business. They've struggled for a long time. And That was their argument. Which, you know, you think to yourself, well, what's wrong here? You know, if our own people, and that's the point I think you were also making, Jody, that sometimes it's not the white people that is actually suppressing us. It's our own people. And the realization, whether it's in their own interest or not, is how do we come to a point when they understand that it's affecting, you know, generations of us, you know? It's not just a segment of our population, but those sort of legislation, you know, comes down and affects us. So how do we then, you know, open the dialogue to make people really conscious of this debate, and what can we do as academics to actually change people's minds and hearts to actually look at things in a different way?
I think, one, I'd like to start what just happened here in the room. I rarely get a chance to speak to Joey, and to be able to know or to be a brother in arms with the work he may be doing or trying to affect policy, or Dean Jackson, all, you know, at Penn. To know that we exist, I think, is the first piece. But to also come together more often and to have a game plan from there. I always think of, I don't know, when I was sitting here, I was thinking about the Million Man March for some reason, because they came because, you know, you rarely see anyone like you who care about this issue. And then they left with a plan to come back. Now, it didn't happen, but they had a plan to come back and talk about when you went back into your community and you connected with X, Y, and Z, how did that connection go to helping you along with what you were doing? So I think more of this, but also helping Robin. You know, Robin and what she's trying to do in policy. How do we collaborate and also push beyond just collaboratively writing, you know, writing and looking for research money, but beyond that, helping with pushing policy, even if it's at another university or it's local or state or federal areas, you know, wherever it is, we need to do this together.
Well, I think something that really concerns me at this point is that as we are kind of entering another era in which we are we tend to be more aware of race, ethnicity, low income, you know, just by the rhetoric, the political rhetoric, and how that made it even if you were not really involved, you are involved now in some way or another, because you hear it in places, in public spaces. Who is out, who's in, what group is less, what group is more, and these groups have been changing, right? And so I think what really concerns me is now thinking about policy. Any policy that comes out anywhere from any of the secretaries that are going to come, you know, they're going to be instituted. Now I'm going to be like super alert, kind of, what is that? What does that mean? Because now we see with all your great examples how a policy that maybe most people don't really even know of how, let's say, insurance companies kind of think about pricing, how the enormous effect. Now it just seems like, you know, what is the housing secretary is going to think about? What is education in terms of vouchers, or what is you know, the Department of Health and Human Services in terms of grants? Where is that going? Are they going to take all the social sciences from this and diversity research and anything they have to do with special populations, right? Like now it seems like we just have to be hyper alert in terms of what is that policy about. Because likely it's going to have some very strategic, right? Very keen, very focused ways to get at an area that unfortunately probably is going to just go straight to the community, the most vulnerable communities. And that, I think, is our call to be as those who are closer to the reading, to the policies, you know, to alert. To bring out awareness, to write about it, to really call for action in terms of all kinds of policies that we're going to see at least in the next 4 years, that are going to be threatening to equality and justice.
And one step further, mobilize communities.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, you know, communities, we underestimate our communities, we really do. But I've done major things in communities by just mobilizing them, you know, telling them what's wrong here and what's going on, and the next thing you know, I've got a whole group of people wanting to join me. I mean, you know, I've done that so many times. I mean, it's just understanding what their positions are.
And I think building on this meeting, continuing to meet, there's something very powerful about this being interdisciplinary. But what we all have in common is this commitment to social justice, equity, diversity. So I would love to see us in some capacity continue to meet. The conversation here, like Cherry, I like the word passion over commitment. I felt like I was at a family reunion. This was comfortable to me. And so the exchange of ideas, this passion, creating a space that allows for that, I think is something that I hope that we can consider
How about taking
exploring.
that interdisciplinarity even further and pressing it, using it as a tool for our work in the way that I found successful over at Bogart Auditorium when we got 1,200 USC students together to ask whether we should pour liquor for Stanley Tukey Williams. Stanley Tukey Williams, 2008, just been put to death by Arnold Schwarzenegger on death row. And what I'm asking 1,200 USC students who are concerned about crime is whether they should express ritual solidarity with a cold-blooded first-degree murderer who helped start the Crips. Okay, that's the call of the question. Right? And this is a tough audience now you're trying to sell this to. And over the course of the evening, we had Maida DeValier, Lula Washington Dance Company, Ice Cube, artistic performance after artistic performance, Lupe Fiasco, right, with connected by op-eds. So the big picture, so we give them a bigger framework, a normative framework, but then the art, here comes the art, right? So, and through that art, by the end of that evening, when we asked, we had Brenda's Got a Baby by Tupac, Lula's Washington Dance Company did a Alvin Ailey style dance, interpretive dance to that, you know, and asked whether that baby that Brenda had, that turned out to be Tukey Williams before she was killed, slain, you know, all of that. By the end of that evening, you had almost all those 1,200 students standing up with their lighters lit. I don't know what they do now, but back in 2007, they used to light up the lighters with their lighters lit up in the air, showing solidarity for Stanley Tukey Williams. Right? We got from completely otherness, they are other, wicked, criminals, to I feel your pain, I feel the story, I feel the narrative. Narrative is radical because it creates us at the same time it's being created. Right, it creates an us. It's a political tool. But you know, can we cross boundaries? That's the fight. We got to get in that fight. You know, and use art, use the musicians, use the whatever the things that really seem to work for people, to move people, you know, to bond people to others are narratives and art.
And that's Cherry said something to the effect of how do we mobilize to change people's hearts, because it's clear some folks don't have the capacity or either not thinking too clearly, so they're being motivated and responding by something other than cognitive abilities, I would suggest.
But I think creativity is connection, right? Like, so through this creativity, and I think we can think about that in lots of ways. Like meeting again, I think the energy in this group and the kind of space that's created is part of it. Part of it is like really figuring out what's already going on in our communities, because you know we don't have all the answers here, right? Even though we're a group of a lot of scholars, you know, we need to talk to activists on the ground and artists, and I think if there are ways that we can sort of use our knowledge that we're creating through our work and communicate back and forth with what's kind of being done. You know, this is another kind of boundary spanning, another creativity. And I think, I'm losing my last, I have one more.
Creativity is connected.
Oh, and then the last thing is
It's called priming.
the image thing. And the last thing is, I think part of when we say like next step, some things we can work out, but some we have to let to like the magic of connections that we can't imagine yet. Like I think we do have to have a forum where we can stay connected, but in this era where it's an organic process. Like we can't really visualize or anticipate what could all come from this, but we know that there's something here. We can feel it intuitively. But I think also in this time that we're in, as you pointed out, Eric, like this is serious. Like this is dangerous, and it's, you know, we all, because we're here, have certain privileges. So I think we really have to be listening and be aware of what, and be willing to be allies in many ways with each other, but also with our communities. And I feel a strong sense of need that we're going to have to support each other in lots of different ways in these coming years.
So, okay, so to take it one step further then, what do you think we should put forward to the dean? Because she's coming at 4 o'clock. She's actually
Put your happy face.
I think we're all in agreement that this shouldn't be the end.
We should meet again and have food and figure out the rest later. Food and drink. I'm kidding.
I think that what we need to do is that we have to have something solid to actually ask her for. I think that is important. If we want another event like this, then we have to ask her so she becomes committed to it. My thoughts are that, you know, it wouldn't be a bad thing to have another one like this, maybe structured in a little bit different way. Maybe have some community people in the room. I don't know what you think, John. You know, and have it in a, you know, so we can actually hear some of the pain. I know we are feeling pain, but I think that our pain, you know, I think there's different elements of pain. You know, I mean, I'm not doing without, okay? I can afford things. The community that I serve in Jordan Downs, there's 700 public housing there, and I wouldn't even put a dog in any of those places. Even though, you know, money's been spent on it, there's so much work that actually needs doing in communities like that. I mean, it's a constant thing, okay? That's my definition of where people should live. Other people feel that that's fine. Where they live is totally okay. There's no issue, there's no problem. But I think that we have a duty, you know? We are the people who are, you know, at a certain standard. I'm not saying that we're the Bolsheviks, but I'm actually saying that we've reached a certain standard in our lives, and so therefore we should help others. Absolutely. And how are you going to help others? You've got to be able to mobilize and let people understand what their position is. We can't do it on our own, but we can't do it either to have an interaction like this one. I can't just organize things. I actually work here. and therefore, you know, the dean plays a very important role in what I do. She's committed to it, so let us use that commitment now to sort of forward our goals, and that's the point I'm trying to make.
And let's broadcast this. That makes her look good. That increases the support for us, right? When we can show that the school looks good. If the school doesn't look good, we don't look good, right? And so that's what I even found with Michael Quick when he came through. You know, when we were starting this whole process last year, this inclusion diversity stuff, it struck me early on in the process that we have to tout and trumpet our successes to reinforce him and the leadership in this university to say, hey, this looks good. I see some positive feedback coming from these investments, right, institutionally, to our brand, right, because that's what they understand. Come on, we all understand that. When we're put in a leadership position, we understand we have certain obligations that come with that role in office, right, and so so if we can, you know, I don't know if this recording, you know, often the toughest thing with these recordings, you need someone to edit it, and then you start sending it out.
It will be well edited.
Good.
I think that people can feel very secure about, you know, the interaction that we've had here today. The whole experience is to allow an open discussion and to gather from that discussion what needs changing to actually help us to move on. And I think the only way that we can move on is through conversations like this, really. Because now I'm really fired up to start lots of things. And, you know, which this morning I was feeling a bit tired. I'm not now. I mean, it's just that energizes to hear other people wants to be committed.
Well, you know, Marilyn specifically mentioned the 12 grand challenges that the Academy of American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare identified. And although we're of different disciplines, these are cross-cutting issues. Things like promoting healthy youth development, closing the health gap. I mean, these are things all of us can connect to, right? There are issues that span micro, meso, macro. And that's something that is very much on her radar, something she's very much wanting to be meaningfully integrated into every aspect of what we're doing in the school and our curriculum training, you know, students and in research. So if we were thinking about something to pitch or some direction, at least in terms of initial thinking about what is the next step, or how do we do something innovative? That's the other big, you know, sort of catchphrase, right? Innovation. Thinking about how can we leverage our intellectual capital, right, around some of these grand challenges. And maybe it's sort of breaking up. Some of us are more in sort of health focused, some of us are in education, or, you know, things like that. But there's different ways to think about how we might, you know, sort of focus our energies around this. But I think that's something that she could, it would resonate with her. It would certainly fit with priorities that she already has, and that fit not only within the school, right, in the university, but wider in the field. And they're set up as a way of, these are societal problems, wicked social problems that all of us, right, should be concerned about and have a stake in. So that's just a suggestion in terms of thinking about what potential next steps could be. Is that we could talk about, well, we want to come together again, obviously, but also think about how might we be able to work together around some of these wicked social problems, these social, grand challenges.
Chiming in, I think that is an awesome idea, especially when we're looking at the grand challenge, and you're right, they span across all of us, probably in multiple areas. I see myself in like 3. But maybe that is one of the first steps. The people at the table, you know, we all get on some sort of dividing each other up. Where do we fit? You know, figuring out where we fit. And really the next step may be the racial ramifications of the 12 challenges. Because a lot of us are all of us are really talking about that. So that's a piece that sometimes gets lost when we look at things like these grand challenges. I've seen it happen before, where race sort of becomes this thing in the background that no one really wants to focus on, but we know how important it is stopping family violence, closing the health gap, creating social response, achieving equal opportunity and justice. So,
or race becomes class.
Right, where race becomes class. So maybe that is the next step, making sure we're all in one of those hubs or multiple hubs, seeing who our alliances are, and maybe the next time we do get together, talking about the racial ramifications of the 12 challenges and where we fit.
And do we adopt a particular community? Like, you've got Jordan Downs, so since you already have it, then we can take that, do a needs assessment, get some really clear goals. By the time, maybe not the next time we come back together, but we divvy up whatever and create something after the needs assessment is very clear, and we have the goals and we see the outcome measures at the end. We could then write about it. It'd be our own research, and we could actually see the community. For instance, if it's Jordan Downs, we're going to take health disparities. If we're going to take any of those the 12 challenges there, we can take those and look at that because it's the community that we're serving.
But not everybody is from this community.
No, I mean, not everybody's from, but they can do the same thing in Ohio or wherever they're from.
But to piggyback on
And it may be interesting to compare notes because, like, we're colleagues now. So if we do this, then we could even have some reliability and validity across. It's like we're doing this, so we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. It's like let's try that. This works here in where are we? Los Angeles, and then it'll work in the West End of Ohio or the South Side of Chicago.
Or the east side of Austin.
The east side of who?
Austin.
Hey, yeah.
But
Austin has a problem?
I think there's a part of, where the conversation, and I'm sure all of us kind of have been in these conversations in which you really want to do something and kind of trying to think about first, what is going to be our audience, trying to decide, because certainly we have the opportunity to talk to different audiences, right? So there's the part where, do we write this up and talk to other scholars about it? Is this kind of a thinking about this and really bringing awareness at that level? Or you were mentioning community. Now, for me, communities may feel or maybe a group of folks very different than what you were thinking of community. So what does that mean in terms of, as an outcome? What would be a doable, a pragmatic outcome from these conversations? This kind of a white paper that starts establishing a framework in terms of how we're thinking and highlighting concerns and issues, and this is more kind of a conversation that is more scholarly? Is this something that translates into a little bit more pragmatics in talking to communities?
Otherwise,
organizational leaders, community leaders, and invite them, and then have that link with community in that sense. So I'm still not sure about that, but certainly that's worth clarifying to see how are we going to funnel our efforts and to what extent.
What if it was like working groups? What if we envision the next one is us, in working groups with people from the community, whether it's one particular community, who are, brainstorming with us on next steps. So maybe the next steps shouldn't just come from us, right?
Well, that's the needs assessment part. If we're going to help the people, we probably want to know how they frame the problem.
Well,
yeah,
right,
I agree.
Like in partnership, right? So that we're all around the table together, and you can think of it as sort of a together, everyone together, but also breakouts, right? If we're having a few themes that we're going to focus on, looking at kind of race in these 12 areas. But I would love to see, because we're talking about research or community, like, I think there are ways that we could start to kind of think together, and then again, like maybe some things would come out of that are hybrid in a way.
I think that's the next meeting. Well, it seems to me we should have homework before then, but if a next meeting has to do with focus, specifying the direction that we're going, the mechanism, what the outcomes are. I agree with Tian, if there's a way to frame this in relation to the grant challenges, then weaving in this diversity and inclusion piece. If we're able to introduce innovation, certainly this is innovative, bringing people, scholars, community folks from different disciplines to look at the same issue. If we use technology to continue meeting, to sustain what we've started here today, thinking about concept papers or the grants and the papers and the proceedings, that kind of thing.
Or even the
maybe Eileen has been trying to talk for a while.
Thank you. Maybe I was just asking you to pass the sugar, but anyway. This is probably a minority, or clearly is a minority opinion. I don't actually think we should invite community people in yet. And maybe I'm saying that because I do a lot of community-based participatory research, so I feel I've been very involved with communities, and that's essential eventually. But what I also see is that you bring in sort of token people from a community, and you get they're not really necessarily speaking for full communities. They're putting them in a very strange situation for them. It changes the dynamics, and I guess so as someone who's completely committed to community-based participatory research, I actually think we have a few steps first before that. And one of the things that has struck me, and maybe it's just because I'm interdisciplinarily kind of alone here, is that I would like to know, I would have felt like, I mean, I know I took too much time as it was, but I would have liked to have a little more time to talk a little about some of what I've done and thought and get some reactions. And I know I would have, when I was just listening to the performance that was going on a few minutes ago, I was very struck by it, in part because I thought you guys were actually agreeing on basic things, but it wasn't coming off that way. Right. And I wondered if I knew more about what you, it seemed like you were talking in some ways strategically about when you're in practicing law, you know, you just can't, you're not going to get very far with certain comments. Well, I'd like to know much more about that, because obviously we're going to think about law as one place where we might actually do, you know, work for some social change. Those of us who know nothing about it whatsoever might benefit by knowing more. And at the same time, you know, when I heard what you were saying about how people knock the statistical argument, as someone who does a lot of statistics, I think I understand really well both how people misuse them and how you actually can answer people who are misusing them with statistics that are better statistics. So, and more thoughtful. So in some ways, I'd rather, and again, I may be the only one who feels this, and so we can just blow off what I said as soon as I finally stop talking. But I'd like, since we are interdisciplinary, but we are all committed to some of the same goals, I'd like us to be able to do a little deeper dive in the different disciplines we represent or the different fields we represent. You know, because I can have all kinds of ideas about, well, we should use the law to do this, but I know nothing about it. and part of what you were saying to me, not to me personally, but was, boy, things you thought might have worked have already been tried and, you know, fallen short. So it's not just not reinventing wheels, but, you know, it's that 1 + 1 = 3 thing that was brought up earlier. It's how can we make our numbers synergize to come up with something more.
From a sustainability standpoint, one way we may be able to make an impression on the provost, the president, those who determine whether we get continued funding, deans, but especially can think of provost and president, are tying scholarship to what we're doing. You know, work products. You know, institutional leaders love work products. You know, we're getting Sean Harper here. We're going to have a whole institute dedicated to understanding racial inclusion and equity and diversity better. And I assume there's going to be some publication arm to that of some kind. If we could get some of our thoughts reduced to writing and put out in some kind of publishable form, that's when you really build some momentum, and they start to see what your success is tied to the institution's success, because you're raising their profile nationally, internationally. Everybody loves, you know, clicks and all the rest of the stuff that we can generate from, you know, really kind of edgy, cutting-edge conversation that questions platitudes and receives wisdom and is willing to strike out in new directions and take on paradigms that seem common sense, but might be really counterproductive when we dig deeper.
It's actually a great idea. I completely agree. Sean Harper just totally off the radar for a second, but I think that is a great idea. I still have the grand challenges, but I think because that's the university-wide, you know, thing now that's being established, and so there's a lot of investment, university level, that's going.
We can do both.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Sort of connecting, you know, sort of this focus. We can call it the grand challenges, but it's really social injustice. It's you know, wicked social problems, right? Everybody can sort of wrap their head around that. but have sort of a infrastructure almost by tying that work potentially through this new center. I mean, of course, maybe that's one of the things for next time is we have Sean Harper come and talk about sort of his vision for this center, or what Michael Quick is thinking about, or something like that. But that gives us a place potentially to locate, the work through. I don't know how Marilyn would feel about that being not located specifically in the school, but
well, she asked me
like
to
his
set up a
ideas.
meeting between herself and I and Sean Harper. So I think perhaps, we're thinking of collaborating with him anyway. We'd like to, because so that's definitely on the dean's radar.
Do we have any publishers we can reach out to? I don't know what kind of networks we have. If we don't, we need to build some. I know George Sanchez is tied into the California press, right? And he's got a number of people over in the Ethnic Studies Department, American Studies Department, published manuscripts, got them out there. I think a good number, like 14 or 15, and 8 or 9 of them are award-winning. I mean, that's what can happen if we can just get that kind of focus and start cranking this stuff out. It not only enhances the impact of our work, but makes our career trajectories a lot better. So there's a lot, we don't feel like we're just, spinning our wheels. We're actually doing things on a lot of levels.
I would like to even make the suggestion, even the next step after that, of how do we take that work and meet policymakers, have these meetings, whether again, local, state, or federal, wherever we're at, that we use this work that we have, something that is published, this massive sort of combating these wicked deeds. We have to have an avenue, we have a plan for what's the next step, because I would love to see that. I'd love to see us meeting legislators and saying, this is what was published, we've published things like this the past couple of years. This area, your area, that area, my area, education, this is what we're seeing, this is what policy should be moving toward. We have to have some sort of influence on that.
To me, that gets at this idea of products and dissemination, and being able to argue or offer a rationale for why this group, why an interdisciplinary group. I think some of it has to do with learning from one another. And so I agree with you. I think it would be nice if we were able to share what we understand about these concepts through our lens, from our perspective, offer strategies to one another. So it seems to me if we're able to think about those products, not necessarily needing to decide on them right now, but knowing that in some way we've got to justify this collaboration, whether it's through the grand challenges, the wicked problems. It needs to be, it needs to go beyond this room. Right? So it's got to, in some way, impact a community. And that can be directly, it can be through scholarship, it can be in our classrooms.
It can be everything.
All of the above.
Yeah, I think that could be multi-pronged. We start to envision sort of multi-pronged outputs, right?
Okay, so what are we going to say?
You haven't been taking notes on all this?
Summary of everything we've said.
She gave me the look.
I'll tell you.
David,
Terrence?
What'd you say? I was going to say something. I think, a couple of things we have to think about in terms of the identity of the group. There's many of you are probably private institutions. I know we're not above your state. In your state faculty are under different pressure to be able to be advocate scholars, right? So you kind of have to watch how you approach this and what you can do in terms of your connections with the community. As an administrator, I always feel that pressure because I get called when people don't like what you're saying. It doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. It's that you're saying it and somebody else is paying your salary. And so you have to deal with those pressures, especially if you don't have tenure yet, or if you're seeking to get promoted to another rank. So as faculty, there are pressures there. But I was going to say, I think that one thing that deans all align on is the need to have some kind of scholarly product out of anything they've invested in, because you're moving a needle, you're moving something, there has to be some outcome that is a tangible impact factor. So aligned with what Arlene was saying, I think that perhaps the next meeting or some framing of this one is about us submitting our work for an edited manuscript, and a few of us take co-editorship over it, frame the context of the meeting and what comes out of it, and this becomes an annual release for the school, and it can come with the school's name on it, and it can justify bringing folks together each year, so that you have faculty who will get a publication out of it. You have some kind of agenda or some kind of broader research question that's being addressed in that, and at the minimum, that's a very low cost effort. You're only paying for transportation, and people we do what we do anyway. So if you're thinking about something that you propose, just making sure this goes for the next 5 years, and out of that you guarantee this out of the Suzanne, Dworak-Peck schools focus on race and social work or social justice and causes and the like. And what you then have at the end of 5 years of putting out this edited volume, each year a different volume, is a group of scholars who have experienced something that this school had to offer. And that was something to come together around a community focused on social justice, social work, and the like. So there is a way to align, and then you build courses around it, you build training, you build broader discussions around maybe a chapter or some section of the book. New issues come up, you build a section on hot button issues, but just having that tangible product pays for itself in terms of bringing the folks together and gives a rationalization for bringing folks together. So a lot of stuff we could do, but I think at minimum, submitting some of our work that has not already been published, but addressing thoughtful ideas, even if they're essays or reviews of someone else's work, they go into this volume. The volume, you all got a publisher here?
Yeah, that was what we intended to
All
do.
right, so, well, yeah, so don't.
So
yeah.
thank you.
Yeah,
And-
well,
no, I
my
think
paper
that-
that's already in another journal can't go in there, so we gotta frame it so that, you know, you get me the details.
I think this is I think that's a really great idea, and actually our school already has experience doing this last 5 years with other initiatives like the Science of Social Work, where the past 5-6 years we've met once a year. There's conversations, people connect and across and build, basically write papers, and that is has become a very organic process. So there's already 5 years worth of papers that a journal allowed us to publish on. So we are kind of building, at least in the field, the notion of science in social work, and what does that mean? And then we go in all kinds of different directions and so forth. So at least the school has experienced that, has seen that it works. I mean, it's continuing. So that is an indication at least that it's working for the school and for the institution. So so certainly we have developed some experience in doing that. So it's just a matter of, I think for me, it's just a matter of what is the framework that really unifies our work, in which we can take it, we can meet there and then start branching out in terms of the kinds of contributions and or discourse that we want to produce. And I think that will just set the platform to be able to do, okay, this legal ramifications, this organizational ramifications of equality and so forth. And really start building, I think, we have the potential to start building a narrative, printed narrative, as well as a video and all, because now we have technology, and really reach out, because we also have ventured into other dissemination strategies of communication that includes really short videos that is, of course, for many, that's much more powerful than the actual papers, but that is another way. So just kind of to throw in some of the stuff that we've done.
One theme that's come out of here that might be, and this is just tentative, as an organizing theme that I've heard today, is the contest between macro level social explanations of behavior and explanations that rest on personal pathologies of the people that we're concerned about, the plight of those we're concerned about. Do we reduce social problems to personal pathologies? And what happens when we do that? How we, how that's just a standard move and it's pernicious. And it's like once you catch a thief, sometimes a whole string of crimes is solved. Once you catch one conceptual error, it explains a whole lot of other conceptual errors right in its wake, right? And I think this is one of those classic ones. In social work, you're coming from a social perspective versus this individualistic, kind of internal perspective. You're saying look at it from a collective, macro level, social determinants, structural factors, and that's a tough fight. And if you can get Americans to start to just think that way, I make myself, I'm going to dumb me up after this, I make myself sit down and watch Bill Riley at least a half hour a week. And it's painful. It's excruciatingly painful.
For like an hour straight.
Yeah, it's excruciatingly painful, but it's so helpful. It's helpful. I know the acoustics in the room when I walk in. I know what this other side is hearing, how they're framing it, how to kind of respond to that and anticipate their framing. Right. But it's painful, I'm telling you. But if we could come to those basic levers, those basic conceptual cornerstones and argue out, really drill deep into them.
And that conflict or tension, that's been part of the social work profession since the beginning. We talk in terms of the person in the environment.
Yes.
We talk about individual autonomy and responsibility versus that of society. And there are those who still argue that the profession has abandoned its mission to serve the vulnerable, marginalized groups. We talk about the worried well, and this idea, and there's a book called Unfaithful Angels that talks about this idea that the social work profession has moved away from that mission. So I think this would resonate, at least within social work. People are familiar with that framing and discussion.
Okay. Well, the dean's been called away, so she said Cheryl will deal with it.
So you're gonna write us a blank check then, right? Then you out all of it.
So what I'd like to say is that, what people have said around the table is really very meaningful. We've got Susie here who's been writing it up all day long, and we also got the video. The only piece that I'm concerned about is that I really would like to see something linked to community. I really think that people struggle a lot. It's hard to make changes in communities without having the tools, and I think this could be a tool for change in communities. And so therefore, I take the point, and we intended to do something like what you suggested, David, and to write, to get your papers, to write all this up, and also to tailor the video to ensure that it can be used for other events and open for people to see that there is a live debate going on and that this is a debate that's going to continue, and to join it with both Sean Harper's News Centre. Everybody's joining with Sean Harper's News Centre, by the way. So I know it's only 60% of, 60% of these centres around America, isn't it? So it's only a very small percentage. So he's like gold coming here. So I can see that, and there's a whole line of people that want to work with him, and they probably, is higher on the list than we are, because we weren't the people who were bringing him here. Somebody else is. Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm mindful of that. I'm just being honest, and so I'm mindful of that one. But I think that's a good idea, and I don't know, Jody, if you know him personally.
Not well, we all got to get to know him because he is the conduit through which a lot of resources for inclusion and diversity are being channeled.
Right. Right, and he was an alumni here in the School of Education. So we're hoping that we'll have a strong connection with him. What I
You remember he's leaving us.
Oh yes! Oh my God!
I know Sean very well.
Rubbing it in, right? Just rubbing it in.
So I've had to come to terms with the fact that this is in fact happening. But definitely when I get back and let him know what we did here and make sure he's primed to be in conversation with us
perhaps
about
you
it.
can introduce him.
Absolutely.
To him. I'd love that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so, you know, wow. Oh, wow.
Well, you know, we got a job there.
I was the one trying to stop him from going, but.
You're welcome.
We you know the way academia is set up, like what we decided was we'll probably see each other more when he's here than we ever did when we were in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Just 'cause, you know, all both running around. He is all he's cracked up to be. I mean, fantastic. You all are very, very fortunate.
Well, we really wanted him here, so we're really excited. We've got, you know, we have such a high agenda for him that, you know, that's the other thing with us too, that often we're set up with such high agendas that we can't complete it. And then when we can't complete it, people turn on us. So, you know, those sorts of factors too, we've got to remember that we're only humans like everybody else. But just having one person in that position can be a tough one too. So, but on the bit about the grand challenge as well, I think Tian is right, and Devon, that you know that could lay a good foundation for us because it covers everything. So I don't think anything is out of pushing forward. I think that what we ought to do is for me to write this all up to the dean, right? Because she likes everything to be written, and discuss this with her. Tell her what we've agreed, right? So we've agreed, or if somebody thinks that I'm not saying it correctly, tell me now, because I want to make sure that I'm giving all these voices. The other thing is too that I'm going to say to her, we would like to keep the same team that we have, because now we've set the ground rules, haven't we? And we know what we've decided. So this is our group, so to speak. Because I think in some ways that's easier to deal with than to have a whole new different group come in with different ideas. Now we sort of set the place to have this for a bit till we know, the direction we're going. So I can hold people accountable. I can reach out to learn. I can, reach out to planning. I can just reach out to various different people and feel comfortable with it because we've been around this table. Am I correct that I can reach out to you all? Right. Okay, so, that people aren't going to say, oh, I got no time, or I can't be bothered, or not that you would, but, in case you did. Just to ensure that, we're on the same track. And then the idea then is if we can produce something, we can get all those factors lined up and things mobilized, I think we'd be in good stead. And then when do you think we could have another one similar to this? Because then I would put this in my own budget so that, I'd hold it strongly and argue for the fact that we need this. So would people be committed to having it in when?
I know Eric had made mention of science and social work meeting every year, but I almost feel like that's too long.
Yeah, sure.
I just know momentum.
Right.
I feel like we have some momentum now. I know everybody's got over busy lives and that sort of thing, but I just honestly think
We
the
could
years too long.
actually
But
Skype as well.
Devon had mentioned something I think we can definitely capitalize on, which is technology. So we don't have to physically come together
Exactly, we
again
can
to come
Skype,
together
yeah.
again. Right, so that's something that we, and it's certainly cheaper, much easier on your budget if we do like a video conference or, you know, something like that.
I think that one of the things that are good though is to see people physically. There's something about it. You can, you know, your body language speaks, what you say speaks. Now, when David gave his presentation and he talked about Trump, and that he, you know, he was supportive of Trump, and he saw all our faces. Well, I was thinking about that because if I was in another place virtually, I don't think I would be bonded to him, because my thoughts would be that there must be something that he's thinking about Trump. I mean, it's just, you know, because I think that the way people do things have a lot to do with what people say to them, and whether what they say to them is true or not, you form impressions of them. I do think that in our line of work, it's always good to see people. On that basis, you know, I'm not sure we're going to get any money.
21st century is going to lead us in a direction of many different areas that we can focus on that haven't been present before. And it's our responsibility to be on our toes to go out and do this work. So, and I'm hoping that this isn't, as we always say in public education, a one-stop deal. You know, we meet, we feel good about each other, and then we leave and we never meet again. And the next subject will be about the deprivation of cartoons. You know, it's always something new. This is too important. And finally, you know, I always had this quote that followed me throughout grad school, sort of vacillated in my mind when I was thinking about the closing, but just saying that President Roosevelt had mentioned, far better is it to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to remain with those poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much, because they live in the gray twilight that know not victory nor defeat. We have too much to do to sit on the sidelines. We need you to step out of the gray twilight into the bright sunshine so that we can all see the dawn of a new day. And I think this is the beginning of a dawn of a new day. And finally, good day and safe travels back to the faraway places you all live. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.